Hi everyone, welcome back to the Mobile Robot Systems course. In this sixth lecture, we will be focusing on planning algorithms. So what we're interested in is methods that allow our robots to plan paths in cluttered environments whilst considering any motion constraints that it may have. In particular, I will go through three main classes of methods, that is combinatorial, sampling-based, and potential field-based, so that you can choose the right ones for your given applications. Without further ado, let's get started.
So in this lecture, we will be focusing on the topic of navigation and path planning for a mobile robot in the ground plane. In order to talk about path planning, we will introduce the notion of a configuration space. And then we'll follow up by looking at three general method classes. So we'll look at combinatorial methods, sampling methods, and potential fields. As always, I like to bring the content of this lecture into the broader context of this course. So what we're looking at now is how to implement the action module specifically through motion control with navigation in mind. So navigation is the ultimate goal that we want to achieve with our mobile robots. So in order to do that, we can't actually look at navigation, in other words, planning in isolation. We have to consider motion control in conjunction because our robot platforms are constrained, and the control commands that we execute on our platforms will be a function of the planning algorithms, or are dependent on the planning algorithms that we choose to use as our underlying foundation for this. And what I want to highlight here is the fact that to plan and to navigate inside a world, we actually need a model of the world. And the reason I'm mentioning this is even if we assume that our world model is perfect, and even if we assume that we have perfect actuation on our platform, so noise-free actuation, I want to highlight that the problem of devising navigation algorithms and searching for optimal paths is not an easy problem. And I want to illustrate this with an example that hopefully convinces you of this fact. So in this movie here, what you can see is a quadrotor navigating through a very cluttered environment. So what I'm showing you here is that planning a trajectory is more than just it's about more than just exerting motion control that leads a robot from A to B. So what we're particularly interested in is scenarios that present us with constraints, because those are the scenarios that we would most likely encounter in the real world, right? Such as obstacles and other environmental disruptions. So note that what I'm showing you here is a hard case in the sense that we're looking at a quadrotor platform, whereby quadrotors, as you'll recall, are non-holonomic vehicles, and certain trajectories here are simply dynamically infeasible for this platform, right? And additionally, we have hard constraints that this quadrotor has to deal with, in the sense that it has to plan a path through an incredibly cluttered environment. And we can, of course, create analogies to other types of vehicles, even ground vehicles that are non-holonomic. Think of cars that have turning constraints, or even differential drive robots, which we talked about, and the fact that we need to linearize the inverse kinematics in order to be able to create feasible motion control commands. And so this is why the planning and the navigation problem is hard. So I'd like to start off by introducing a key concept, and this concept is what we call the robot's configuration space. Okay? So first of all, we will assume that the world that we're living in, so that our robot lives in, has two entities, so the robot itself, or the robots themselves, and obstacles. And both will be considered as closed subsets of our workspace, or our world, in other words, right? And we'll also assume that the space for motion planning is going to be the set of possible transformations that we can apply to the robot, right? So the configuration space is essentially a set of all possible transformations that we can perform on the robot, which we're considering as a rigid body. And this abstraction of configuration space is important because it allows us to use the same motion planning algorithms to problems that differ in potentially different geometries and kinematic constraints. For example, if we have one solution that works for a given abstraction, then we might be able to transfer it to a different type of platform, for example, a manipulator that is to grasp an object, as well as a quadrotor that is to navigate to a given goal position. So given this abstraction of configuration space, we can develop algorithms and apply them to different robot platforms, bearing in mind that there are some underlying changes that we need to take into consideration, but those don't affect the higher order algorithms that we're developing in order to solve the goal at the macro level, right? So at this point, I want to introduce a little bit of notation, because this notation will be carried through most of the algorithms that I will be presenting in this course, in this lecture. And I want you to be able to understand what we'll be referring to. So first of all, recall that we will be treating the robot as a rigid body. So the complete specification of a robot configuration can then be described by a vector of generalized joint coordinates, right? Where each coordinate can, for example, be an angle for a rotational joint or a length for a sliding joint. These are examples. Now, if we look at the notation, Q here, or vector Q, is our joint configuration, and Q sub j is the joint coordinate, where j up to n, or a capital N here, is the number of joints that we're going to be considering. And this set here is what consists or composes our configuration space. And we'll call this C, or our C space, and this is the space of all possible configurations that our robot can find itself in. Now, continuing with a couple more definitions here, our workspace Rn and the points that are occupied by a robot are subsets of a robot's workspace. Also, importantly, the region that is being occupied by obstacles is a subset of the workspace as well. Now, a useful shortcut is to refer to the set of robot configurations that correspond to collision-free navigation in C sub free, okay, so the free C space. And this is simply our C space set minus our obstacle configuration space, where C-obs, or the obstacle configuration space, is the set of robot configurations in C space that intersect with regions that are occupied by obstacles. So in other words, occupied space is a subspace of our workspace where the robot points, or the points that compose the robot, and obstacle points overlap. Okay, so those are forbidden points, so points that can't be occupied by our robot body that is described by the robot's rigid body model, right? So if we look at an example to make all of this a little bit more concrete, let's consider a robot that is given to us by this triangle, and let's assume that this triangle doesn't rotate in space, so it can only translate. And if we have an obstacle that is here given by this object denoted by O, we can then figure out what the space is that the robot is not allowed to occupy by taking our robot's rigid body, so by taking this triangle, translating it around our obstacle space to find out where our control point is allowed to go, so this red point, and what the boundary is beyond which the control point will lead the robot into an intersection with the obstacle. And so you can see how this area around this gray space here represents C-obs, so obstacle space, where essentially we know now that this is the region into which we cannot control our red point, our control point into, because that is when we collide with the obstacle. And everything outside of C-obs is C-free. So that is the area within which we can control our control point, and we know that our robot will be safe in that area. So this is a concrete example of how we could interpret C free and C obs given a robot's rigid body model. So with these definitions, we're just left with the pragmatic question of how to actually compute these quantities. And I want to start off by giving you an intuition of how we will go about this by taking a look at two more very simple examples. So in our first example, we're looking at the same kind of scenario where we have our little triangle robot that is not able to rotate, it can only translate in space. And we're also assuming that this little triangle has a control point, and so we want to find out what are the regions in this workspace into which we cannot take our control point into, so we cannot command the control point to go into, so that our robot always stays safe and outside of collisions. Okay, so we then do this by, for example, taking this triangle, translating it around our obstacle areas, and we then know that this gray shaded area is the area within which the control point is not going to go into if it wants to stay out of collisions with the obstacles as well as the walls. And if the control point stays in the white region, so in C free, we know that we can take it anywhere and we will safely reach the goal location from this given start location. Okay. In our second example, we actually consider the more realistic case where a robot can turn. So we have a rigid body that we would like to be able to turn. But to simplify computations, we're going to assume that this rigid body is contained within a bounding box. So in this particular case, a sphere. And although this is a slightly conservative approximation, so the robot will not at all given points in time occupy this full area within the sphere, it's a very convenient approximation to make because it simplifies the computation of our C free and C obs domains, right? So here we're assuming our obstacle is always enclosed within the sphere, and it's conservative, yet it very easily allows us to compute these subspaces. So the previous slides showed you how to get C obs through an idea that we term obstacle dilation. But how do we actually compute this dilation, or how do we formally define this process of computing this dilation? So the first thing that I just want you to remember is that our robot has a control point, or we're considering that our robot is controlled at given one specific point in its rigid body. And we can also call this point an origin point, which we will now use in order to formalize this new concept that I'm about to introduce. So it turns out that there is a mathematical construct called the Minkowski sum that allows us to formally compute dilations by considering obstacle regions as sets of position vectors that are defined with respect to an origin point. So what we can see here in this image is two obstacle regions, so A in blue and B in green, and the Minkowski sum of A plus B is this light green shaded area. And this Minkowski sum is basically defined by adding each vector in one obstacle, so A in this case, to each vector in the other obstacle, which is B in this case, to form a new set, A plus B, that gives us the green, light green shaded area. So A plus B is our Minkowski sum of these two areas. Now, how do we use this concept to the problem that we're given, which is the problem of computing free space versus obstacle space? So now again, recall that our robot has a control point, and our robot also has an area A that it occupies, which is defined by a set of vectors. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to represent the area of this robot as minus A, and we're now going to compute the Minkowski sum that returns us C obs, so the obstacle, the configuration space that signifies the region where the robot's area is colliding with an obstacle. And we do that by simply summing minus A to B in the Minkowski sum notation. And you can see how intuitively, if we take this area minus A and we shift it around B, where we're generating this light green shaded area. And if we look at the right-hand side panels, you'll be convinced that, yes, indeed, if I keep my control point outside of this light green shaded area, then my robot is safe. Then I'm controlling my robot in C-free, and there will be no collisions. So this is how we use this formally defined concept of Minkowski sum to compute C-free and C-obs. Now we have almost all the tools that we need in order to formally define the problem of path planning. And so the last thing that we need to define is the trajectory. So what is actually a trajectory? So first we need to consider that a trajectory is there to satisfy a user's requirements or a designer's requirements, which in this case we're going to represent through a query, where the query is essentially a tuple, which consists of an initial robot configuration, which is in C-free, and a desired goal configuration, which also has to lie in C-free. So the query, intuitively, or in other words, is nothing other than saying, okay, this is where our robot is starting and this is where I want it to end up in. And the trajectory then simply satisfies our query by defining a function that takes as input a time and outputs a position in C-space such that the trajectory at time 0 is equal to the initial configuration and the trajectory at its end is equal to the goal configuration. And this image here below shows you a valid solution for a point robot that navigates from the initial config to the final config whilst remaining in C-free and successfully avoiding any obstacles in C-obs. So as previously mentioned, we will look into 3 different classes of approaches to the problem of path planning in this lecture. So the first one being combinatorial approaches, the second being sampling-based approaches, and the third being potential field methods. And since these methods are all planning methods, we do need a world model, right? And the C-space is going to be our workhorse. So the C-space represents the world model which we will need to be computed a priori before we even start executing any of these algorithms. So next we will actually go through these different methods, and I will explain how they leverage C-space representations in order to return the trajectories we are seeking. But first I want to go through the guarantees that they provide, because the guarantees differ from method to method. So specifically, what do I mean by these guarantees? So first of all, a method or an algorithm is complete if it returns, or if we know that a solution exists, and this algorithm will be able to then find one and otherwise return failure. So this is what we term a complete algorithm. The algorithm is semi-complete if we know that a solution exists and it will find one, otherwise it may run forever. So a slightly more relaxed version of the completeness assumption or guarantee. And an algorithm is resolution complete. If a solution exists, it will find it. Otherwise, it will terminate and report that no solution within a specified resolution exists. Okay, slightly more sophisticated definition of completeness. And finally, we have probabilistically complete, which is if a solution exists, the probability that it will be found tends to 1 as the number of iterations of the algorithm tends to infinity. Okay? So a slightly more subtle definition of completeness. And we will consider algorithms that will differ in these 4 different classifications of guarantees. So let's start by studying combinatorial methods. So the key attribute to combinatorial methods is that they require a ready-made, discretized search space. So what we need to do a priori is to build a roadmap, which in our case is nothing other than a map of all possible paths or roads that lead from initial configurations to goal configurations. Or in other words, a roadmap is simply a discrete representation of C-free. And there are clearly a few options of how to do this. So we can think of various cell decomposition methods, for example, visibility graphs or Voronoi cells or even occupancy grid maps. Or we can think of generating maximum clearance roadmaps, which are constructed through direct construction. So there are a number of different ways we can go about this, and I invite you to have a look around in literature and in books for the pros and cons of these different methods. The third step in computing solution is to then compute a minimum cost path that leads the robot from its initial to its specified goal configuration. And we will be casting this minimum cost path search as a graph search problem. Now, key here is really to note that this cost function is user-defined. So you as a designer will be able to specify what kind of cost you're interested in. For example, it could be simply a path length, or it could be energy expenditure, which is more often than not is directly correlated to path length, but might not necessarily be. So you can define what kind of cost you're interested in having the robot optimize for. Okay? So clearly the result then of our algorithm should be returned as a trajectory, as we previously defined it, that satisfies our query, so the initial and goal configs, and of course all our obstacle constraints. And so practically we can think of the roadmap as a graph, and we can consider edges to be weighted by a cost corresponding to the world that we're trying to represent, and then give these representations and this problem definition to the algorithm so that it can return us with the desired solution that we are seeking. So now a little bit more specifically, we're finally left with one last question, which is, given that we have a structure over which we are searching, as well as a cost function, so these are the assumptions we're making, have now been provided to us, how are we actually going to find our optimal solution? So by what algorithm are we going to return the solution, or this minimum cost path? Again, there are variants to this this algorithm. There are variable solutions. And we will look at one specific solution, which is a well-known solution and is known as the Astar algorithm. So Astar is an extension of Dijkstra's search algorithm, which is used to reduce the number of states explored by exploiting an informed search implemented as a heuristic. Okay, so this is how Astar extends Dijkstra's seminal algorithm. And Astar does nothing other than plan a path from a start state to a goal state. Okay? So what it does at a high level is we start by defining an evaluation function, which is simply the cost of a state n given by two subfunctions. So we have g of n, which represents the current cost from the start to n, and h of n, which is our heuristic function, which estimates the cost to the goal. So h being a heuristic is important, and what it means is that it's essentially a guess about a certain environmental cost. And in order for Astar to be optimal, we need h of n to be something that we term admissible. And admissible is nothing other than signifying that our heuristic function h must always underestimate the true cost. So it must always underestimate the cost from our state n to the goal state. And in most cases, this is not too hard to implement. So for example, if you're planning a path that has to circumnavigate obstacles, a valid implementation for h of n would be simply to take the line of sight path, so the direct path from n to the goal state, disregarding any obstacles, because you know that the straight line path will always underestimate the true path that the robot will need to follow. So in summary, Astar plans a path from an initial state to a goal state, where the set of states is some finite state space, and to do this it simply stores an estimate g of the path cost from the initial state to each state, and initially has that g is equal to infinity for all other states that we haven't yet explored. So let's have a look at the Astar algorithm in more detail by considering its flowchart. So firstly, I'd like to note that there are actually two variants to the Astar algorithm. So the standard algorithm maintains two sets of vertices, one that we call the open set and the other that we call the closed set. But there's also an alternative version or implementation of this algorithm that just considers an open set and does not use the closed set. So this flowchart here considers the version that does use a closed set. So how does this flowchart pan out? So at the start, we consider all of our nodes and states, and the roadmap is unexplored. And the start state alone is in the open set. So clearly, if our open set is empty, then we're ending our algorithm. There's nothing more to do. Otherwise, what we do is we remove the first node n in this open set, and we add it to the closed set. So if n is not our goal state, then it means we haven't reached our goal. And what we're going to do is we're going to expand all the neighboring nodes n prime of state n that are not in the closed set. Okay? So if n prime is in the open set, then what we need to do is we need to basically compute whether or not reaching one of the neighbors through the current path is a cheaper thing to do. And we do this by reordering the position of n prime in our open set. And implementation-wise, we do this by simply maintaining that the open set is implemented through a priority list. So specifically, if the cost of a state n plus the cost of the edge between n and the neighboring state n prime, so Cn to n prime, is less than the current cost of state n prime, then the cost of n prime is set to this new lower value, right? And then we go back to the start of our flowchart here, and we redo this process until we actually find and pop the goal state from our open list. So here's an illustration of the Astar search algorithm, where we're looking at the graph being created by a uniform square discretization of a two-dimensional planar region. And the colors that you see in this GIF that is playing basically represent our different types of nodes. So what we're doing here, first of all, is placing a node in each discretized cell and connecting each node with its 8 neighbors using bidirectional edges, where the cost of the edges are the same as their Euclidean lengths, basically. The gray shape here represents an obstacle, and the filled circles in red and green represent expanded nodes, so nodes that are in the closed set, where the colors essentially are representing the G value, so green is a high G value. Now, what are the pros and cons of Astar? So clearly, Astar is very practical in the sense that it is easy to implement, and it provides us an optimal path cost and is a complete algorithm, right? However, the downsides of Astar are that it has a very high space complexity as it stores all generated nodes in memory. And this is very inefficient, and because of that, there have been a couple of variant versions of Astar that have been implemented, IDA-Star being the most prominent. And I invite you to have a look at IDA-Star as you start going about implementing these search algorithms. And clearly, we're looking at the curse of dimensionality in terms of computational complexity as the growth of the search space is exponential with respect to the length of our solution. There are also other variants of Astar that were also developed more with robotics applications in mind, so taking into account potential motion constraints and replanning versions. So I do recommend also that you have a look at these 3 other variants that I have noted in this little side box here. So at the start of this lecture, I alluded to the fact that the planning problem is hard. But the question is, how hard is it really? So researchers have proven that the general motion planning problem is Cspace hard, and that the best deterministic algorithm known has a running time that is exponential in the dimension of the robot Cspace. See a publication by Canny in 1986 on that. So perhaps this is a good point to give you a quick intuitive reminder of what Cspace actually is. So the intuition behind Cspace is that if a problem is NP complete, then even if you can't solve the problem efficiently, you can still check yes answers efficiently. On the other hand, if NP is not equal to Cspace and you have an instance of a Cspace complete problem that you're convinced has a yes answer, then there might not be any efficient way to convince somebody else of this as well. Okay? So that's the intuition between Cspace hardness. More specifically, in our case, the challenges are that Cspace typically has a high dimensionality. For example, if you think of a rigid body in 3D space, we're already looking at 6-dimensional systems. And simple objects and obstacles in our world may also have complex C obstacles, and it's impractical to compute explicit representations of these so that we can compute the free space for high-DOF robots. And because of all of these challenges and the reasoning that is not so attractive for using general planning algorithms, a lot of researchers have turned their attention to approximations and randomized algorithms that trade off full completeness for major gains in efficiency. So what we're going to look at next is the second class of approaches that allow us to plan paths, which is given to us by sampling-based approaches. So the first approach within the class of sampling-based methods tackles the question of trying to find a better way of actually constructing the discrete search space at the get-go. And this really leads to what we're going to call a probabilistic roadmap. Okay, so the algorithm here will generate a roadmap, which, as you'll recall, is the component that we need before we actually even start the searching process. And so the steps are as follows. We start off with an empty graph G, where the vertices in the graph correspond to robot configurations, and the edges are collision-free paths that would allow a robot to move from one configuration to the next. Okay. So what we then do in step 2 is we sample a couple of configurations denoted by AI here in C-free. And we then use a metric defined in Cspace that allows us to compute a neighborhood set of these vertices, of the vertices that are already in this graph G. We then use a local planner to check if any of these AI, so these vertices, can be connected to points that are already in our graph G within this neighborhood set. And if they are, then we add these new edges, so connecting A to Q, to the edge set if no collision was detected by this local planner, right? And we will then simply terminate when n edges were added to the roadmap. So you'll note here that the number n is predetermined by the designer of this roadmap algorithm, okay? So this is up to you. Now, the goal of this whole roadmap algorithm method is to create meaningful, also more sparse, discrete representations of C-free than a potentially naive discretization. And also note that since we use a local planner, or in other words, this can be a simple forwards planner, we guarantee that the edges are feasible given the robot's motion constraints. And this is really practical. But as you might already have noticed, there is a catch, because as you can see, not necessarily all points or areas in space are actually connected through a connected graph, right? Due to the randomized nature of this algorithm. And this can very clearly lead to problems because the robot might not be able to reach all regions in space and hence may not be able to satisfy the query that we set at the outset of our problem. Okay, bearing this in mind, I just want to walk through an example that illustrates a little bit more in a schematic way what this PRM algorithm might look like. So here's the little animation. We start off with a holonomic robot with magic wheels that allows it to move in any possible direction. And we have obstacles in red, and we have C-free here contained in this environment or in this planar workspace just in white. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to start by initializing an empty graph in our C space. Okay? Next thing that we're going to do is we sample these random configurations, and we test for collisions with obstacles, so collisions that we can directly detect. So the ones that overlap with obstacles in our space will be removed, and we will then retain the collision-free configurations in this current representation. Next thing that we do is then we create edges to our nearest neighbors by invoking the local planner that tries to connect a vertex to its neighborhood set according to some neighborhood metric and of course some sort of model of how vertices can be connected, so with our forwards planner in mind. Once this is done, we remove all the invalid edges, we retain the valid ones, And then we just basically go about repeating this process for all the following vertices. And after a couple of iterations, we will, in the best of cases, end up with a nicely connected graph as such, which is a meaningful representation of the space that the robot can navigate whilst probably or very likely satisfying the query that we want the robot to achieve, right? And so what we do at the very end is we then use this sparse and elegant search structure as an input to a given search algorithm such as Astar in order to be able to plan some optimal route, for example, as shown in this case, the shortest possible route from the robot's start position to the designated goal. So let's summarize the PRM method and analyze its pros and cons. So the requirements for using PRM, or the primitives that we require, are on the one hand a method that allows us to sample configurations in Cspace. And second, we need a method that allows us to check for collisions in Cspace, so collisions with obstacles. The advantages of using PRM are that it's probabilistically complete, which means that with probability 1, if we sample long enough, we will find a solution if one exists. So this is very nice. And we can apply it easily to high-dimensional C-spaces. And we're also able to satisfy fast query processing given start and goal tuples. Now, the disadvantages are that PRM doesn't really work well for narrow passages, right? Because we're sampling in free C-space, and depending on the sampling algorithm, these narrow passages will just simply be missed. And it might also be very difficult to connect vertices depending on your differential motion constraints. So this problem of connecting these vertices generally requires a solution to the boundary value problem. And so let me just revise or recall the definition of the boundary value problem for you. So in maths, in the field of differential equations, the boundary value problem is a differential equation together with a set of additional constraints, so think robot motion constraints, called the boundary conditions. And a solution to the boundary value problem is then a solution to the differential equation, which would also satisfy our boundary conditions, right? So for this reason, it's typically not easy to solve, and for this reason, it's not always a given that we can simply connect our vertices in difficult situations, okay? For difficult robot configurations, for example. And the first and the third point here is related to the first bullet point in the disadvantages, which says that it's hard to sample uniformly in configuration space in some cases, right? So the PRM method that we just saw before produces a roadmap for us that can be used for many start-goal pairs. In other words, we can run multiple queries using the same PRM that we built using that algorithm. Now, if we say that we're happy with just wanting to solve the planning problem for a single query, so one specific start and goal pair, we can tackle the problem with a different method that is also sampling-based and called RRT, so rapidly exploring random trees. Now, how does this work? So we're assuming that we have a given workspace and we want a solution for a specific start and goal pair in that space. Now, the basic idea that RRTs build on is that we're going to try to build a tree by generating next states in that tree, so vertices, by executing random control. Okay? So in this random control, what it will do for us, it will tell us which edges we can actually add to the tree that allow us to grow the tree in its vertices. So here are the 6 steps that we basically need to perform in order to compute our trees. So we first start by initializing a graph G with a vertex corresponding to our initial position, Q sub I. And in this graph, the vertices correspond to robot configurations and the edges correspond to collision-free paths between these robot configurations, given that we have a model of our workspace with obstacles. The next thing we do is that we sample a random state in Cspace. We call that Q sub rand. And the way I want you to think about Q sub rand is that it's an auxiliary point, that at this point we don't know if it's reachable from the robot's current or given configurations in the graph G due to the robot's motion constraints, okay? So we're going to try to see if Q sub rand that we just sampled in open space is feasible or not. If it's not, so the next thing we do is we find the nearest vertex that is already in G, which is Q sub near, and we're going to double check if Q sub near is actually feasible, if Q sub rand is feasible, given that we want to connect it to Q sub near in our current given graph G. Now, if it isn't feasible, this connection, what we're going to do is we're going to invoke a local planner, which for non-holonomic robot will try to find a replacement vertex Q sub nu, also in C-free, that is close to Q sub rand. So Q sub rand is the original auxiliary point that we sampled. And we're going to double check that the edge that connects Q sub near, which is in our graph G, to Q sub nu is indeed collision free. Now, if that connection is now feasible and valid, we're going to add that edge to the graph G, and Q sub nu is going to be the vertex that's added to our graph G, and we're going to discard our auxiliary point, Q sub rand. Then finally, we double check that our graph G doesn't already encode a solution from our initial starting configuration to our goal. If it does, then we simply return this graph G, and if it does not, then we just simply continue with this procedure by looping back to step 2, if we still have enough samples to sample, enough iterations remain. If not, then we basically terminate with a failure or a timeout. So this is in a nutshell how RRTs function. I'm going to illustrate this again with a very simple graphic. So again, we have our little holonomic robot here with its magic wheels. It starts at this green given configuration point and is going to try to reach the goal. And we're going to start by sampling a point in C space, for example, that is not closer than some distance x and not farther than some distance y from the robot's origin configuration point. Now, there's a little trick that we can use, say, if we were using a non-holonomic platform such as a differential drive robot, which says that instead of sampling a point with a random orientation, we could actually directly set a feasible orientation after that point in x and y given planar workspace has been sampled. And the reason this is very practical is because there is only one theta, so only one robot orientation that can actually be reached by a differential drive robot given a certain starting point, right? So the one that basically lies on a circle segment. So that's a little trick that you can deploy here to make the sampling problem a little bit easier. So we connect Q near to the origin point because we determined that this Q near is feasible, and we're going to continue with the sampling process. So now we're going to invoke our sampling to generate our point Q sub rand, and we're going to find the nearest node in our current graph, in this case Q near. Now, we're going to connect Q near to Q rand if the motion constraints allow us to connect those two vertices. So if we do have a holonomic robot, as in this case, this is clearly feasible. If not, say, for example, we sample a Q rand that does not allow the robot to navigate around obstacles, then what we need to do is we need to sample an alternative point Q nu as specified in our algorithm that can be reached from the nearest point in the current graph G. And we invoke our local planner to find this feasible point Q sub nu. Q sub nu is then clearly connectable to the current graph G, so the point, its nearest point Q sub near, and we then connect these vertices and we discard Q sub rand, which we only used as an auxiliary point to find Q sub nu. And this is basically the process that we then repeat in order to grow our tree, adding vertices to our graph. And we continue doing so until we ultimately reach our goal location, which was given to us by this one unique query. So basically, the algorithm terminates when the goal is found. Or, as I mentioned before, when a timeout occurs, for example, the maximum number of samples has been reached. But we can actually also sample more, even after the goal is reached, and then simply choose the best tree. And there are several reasons why this might be an interesting thing to do. And I invite you to read up on the paper, the original RRT paper, to get an intuition of why this must be the case. And also you'll see in the exercises firsthand why sampling beyond the given number of timeout samples or maximum number of allowed samples is an interesting thing to do. So in a nutshell, this algorithm is probabilistically complete, which means that if a solution exists, the probability that it will be found tends to 1 as the number of iterations tends to infinity. How do we guarantee, though, that the goal will eventually be found, right? Because we're sampling randomly in C-free. And the trick to that was hidden in step 2 in the algorithm that I showed you a couple of slides ago, which is simply with a very small probability epsilon, what we're going to do is we're actually going to sample the goal node itself. And then we're going to use our local planner to see if it can be connected to any nearest node in the current graph G in its current state. And we do this by using our forwards planner to see if this can be connected given the constraints of the platform that we're currently considering. And so this whole procedure is probabilistically optimal, and for the details of this proof, I do invite you to read up on the paper by Karaman and Frazzoli, published in 2011, and the references given in the reading list to this lecture. So now let me summarize RRT for you. So this method of rapidly exploring random trees requires a couple of primitives. In this particular case, we're looking at a method to sample configurations in Cspace. And we also need to ensure that we have a method that allows us to check for collisions in Cspace. Okay? Given those two primitives, we then are able to compute these trees. And it does have several advantages. So we know that this algorithm is probabilistically complete, which is an elegant status, an elegant result to have. We know that the rate of decay for the probability of failure is exponential. And we also know that it's asymptotically, that an asymptotically optimal version of RRT exists. So this version is called RRT Star. And I also invite you to look up the research article on this particular method. So the cons, so the disadvantages of RRT methods is that in the case of non-holonomicity, so for robots that can't easily move from one configuration point to a sampled configuration point, generating edges between these vertices is potentially a difficult problem. So as I mentioned before, it might require a solution to the two-point boundary value problem. Now, we can actually get around this challenge by using an alternate trick. And that trick is simply based on the idea that, well, robots for which we have known forwards kinematics models, we can actually just invoke or execute forwards planning by the use of what we call motion primitives. So forwards planning or executing forwards kinematics models is actually equivalent to just generating forwards motion primitives. And the next slide here illustrates what this might actually look like within the context of RRTs. So here you can see a non-holonomic vehicle that has a forwards motion model that resembles that of a bicycle. And we're using motion primitives here to answer the question of how to sample valid robot configurations when it's heavily constrained in terms of its motion, right? So imagine that this vehicle here is actually a bicycle, and it has constraints on how it can move within this environment and connect to any given random samples that we might be drawing. So how does this motion primitive idea work? Well, it's very simple and intuitive. And what it does is it basically spawns random controls from a given origin configuration. But these random controls are actually not completely random. They're actually feasible random ones since they follow the platform's forwards kinematics model. And that ensures that we're only going to be trying to connect to sampled configuration points that have been generated by these motion primitives and that we know a priori are going to be feasible. right? So this method here, by using motion primitives, really ensures that the sample points can be reached for the specific non-holonomic platform that you might be considering. Now, there's one final method that I'd like to talk about very briefly at the end of this lecture, which is the method of potential fields. So it's very complementary and different to the combinatorial search and sampling-based methods we saw before, but it is elegant and interesting for a couple of reasons. Now, the key difference that potential field methods represent with respect to the prior methods is that in this case, no search structure is used. So instead, what we'll be doing is we will be deriving robot controls directly from information about the environment. So in our case, an environmental map. So the name of the method actually gives away its core idea, which is to use potential functions to guide a robot towards or away from regions in its configuration space. So if we look at these three panels here, we can actually go through the steps that are required to generate a potential field that can then be used for robot navigation. So let's assume that a robot starts in the top red part of this panel, so in the top corner. And the first step we then do is to make sure that we have a potential field that attracts the robot, which is starting in this top right-hand side corner, towards its goal that is in the bottom left. Right? And you can see this through a potential that goes from red all the way down to blue. So that's the first step. That's the goal-oriented navigation behavior that would result from this potential field in step one. The second step is then to make sure that we have a potential that repulses a robot from any obstacles that might find themselves in this workspace, right? So we need to make sure that we have a potential field that points the robot away from obstacle regions. And the potential that is given in the center panel here clearly shows that. So red again is a potential that would lead a robot away from that point. And you can see how those three balls there are potentially obstacles in this workspace. And they would be repulsing the robot from those given areas. Now, the final step is then to combine, say, this goal-oriented behavior with the repulsive behavior resulting from the obstacle field into a general potential field that allows the robot to get to its goal whilst circumnavigating the obstacles. So that would be the third step in generating a valid potential field, right? Now, the key question that we need to ask ourselves is how do we actually get robot controls from a potential field, and actually how do we get the potential field in the first place? So the key insight is that a robot's velocity is equivalent to the gradient of the potential function. And a path can then simply be composed by descending the gradient of this function. So let's have a look at how we might actually go about implementing this in the case of a differential drive robot, or a robot that is constrained by its motion. So the reason that we were going to have a look at a very specific example, because in general, creating a potential field in Cspace is a difficult problem, in particular for high-dimensional systems. So as you'll see in this example, already for the relatively simple platform of a differential drive robot, it's much easier to work with a workaround solution as the one I'm going to present to you now. So what we're going to do in this solution is to basically think of computing the vector field directly without necessarily having to derive a potential. Okay? And the trick we're going to employ is to simply create a potential field in the robot workspace instead of the configuration space. So we start by considering the configuration, the workspace, which is here planar space X and Y, without bothering too much about the robot's orientation, right? So the full Cspace, as you recall, for a differential drive robot, needs to consider the robot's orientation since it's constrained in lateral motion along its y-axis given its body frame, right? So that's the differential drive robot for you. Now, once we have a vector field in the robot's work plane, we can then compute gradients of that function, giving us motion inputs that would control the robot through its control point, right? So this recalls, or this should be reminding you of something that you saw in the lecture on motion control, where we talked about robot control points as a proxy to more easily controlling robots when they are constrained through their motion models. And the next thing is, or the idea we're going to leverage is that we're going to use the control point to now compute motion controls at U and omega in order to control the robot, so the actual robot platform. And again, this is an idea that you previously already saw and are familiar with, right? And so the final step then is to use feedback linearization to get the derivatives in the robot's actual C-space. So again, in the case of the differential drive robot, we then, what results of this is x dot, y dot, and theta dot, which indeed are the values that we were looking for in the robot's actual configuration space. And those values are the values that truly constitute the underlying potential field. But we got there through a workaround solution that leveraged this vector field and a robot control point in combination with feedback linearization. Okay? So just to conclude the potential field method, as I did with all the other methods we talked about, here's a quick summary. So what do vector field or potential field methods require? Well, they require representation of the robot's workspace or directly the C-space if we're working with potential fields. The pros are that this is computationally relatively efficient once we have a C-space construction, and that we can plan for an arbitrary number of paths. So the motion strategy or the feedback control is basically just a function of our potential field, and we can compute paths from any given start and end configuration once this potential field is given to us. So it's a multi-query solution to the navigation problem. The downsides of using potential field or vector field methods is that they do suffer under local minima. So it's not guaranteed that the potential field we will derive from this given method will definitely terminate in the goal location that we have queried for. So it might lead to a local potential, a minimum potential in a given other area of our workspace. And if the robot gets stuck in that other area, clearly it will not be driving towards its goal. So there are methods to require to resolve these local minima problems, but they're a little bit more involved and sophisticated. But I do invite you to look up the relevant research in this domain should you be interested. And finally, one challenge we do encounter as well is that if we're trying to derive potential fields directly from configuration space representations, we first have to solve the problem of representing C-space in potentially very high dimensional systems. And that can be quite challenging. So with this, I just want to summarize everything that we saw in this lecture. So we looked at 3 different classes of planning methods. We started by looking at combinatorial methods, which are both exact and complete. They rely on the underlying principle that we need to be able to compute C-space a priori, and we need to be able to generate a roadmap, for example, through a visibility graph or some other discretization methods that we briefly touched upon. When we have these discrete search structures, we can then use them in combination with classical search methods to result in optimal paths from a given start position to a given goal position or configuration. With sampling-based methods, we saw how they're attractive for a number of reasons, especially computationally, but we also realized that they're only approximate and in certain cases not complete. But we know that, or the proofs exist that demonstrate how their resolution are even probabilistically complete, and there are methods that allow us to converge towards these guarantees should we desire to do so, given the trade-off of computation versus efficiency. The underlying principle of these sampling-based methods are that they avoid explicit construction of roadmaps, especially for RRTs, in Cspace, and instead sample path segments that simply check for collisions using local planners. And finally, with potential field methods, we saw how they can potentially be interesting and are quite elegant in a certain respect as well, but they suffer from local minima, which is their greatest downside, and they're also only approximate, so we don't have guarantees for these methods unless we're using them within some very restrictive constraints and assumptions. The underlying principle of potential field methods is that they simply integrate over vector fields to obtain trajectories that result of a combination of robot velocities, or in other words, positions or poses or configurations as a function of time. And we can also use these methods in reactive mode. In other words, we're simply computing velocities as a function of what our vector field is telling us in a very reactive manner. So to conclude, here is a reading list, and I very much encourage you to look up the classical planning methods we talked about in any of in this book here that I'm citing, or if you're interested in to look into these things in more depth in any of these papers that I'm listing here. And with this, I'd like to conclude the lecture on planning and look forward to talking to you in the following lecture.